Welcome, everybody, to Women Plus We've Been Waiting For, a new show that we initiated this year that is really striving to unpack what is not working in philanthropy and impact investing, and where are there opportunities to do things better, because there are definitely opportunities for change. And today we have a very, very exciting guest, Elizabeth Elango. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here and to have this conversation.
Well, Elizabeth, I had the pleasure of meeting you a few months ago, thanks to our dear friend, Cindy Jones Nyland, who also came on the show. And I was so excited to hear about your journey in this new role that you're in as the Chief Executive Officer and head of school at the Global Village Project, which is the first school in the world for refugees, or at least in the United States.
In the world, but in the US, as far as we know, yes.
And so tell us a little bit more about you before we dive into a really exciting conversation around philanthropy.
Sure. Well, I am excited and honored to be on the show, and honored to talk about our work and share thoughts around philanthropy. I am originally from Cameroon in Central Africa, born and raised. I came to the US as a teenager, and actually went to college as a 16-year-old, which is kind of wild. There's a story behind there. But I went to college just up the street from where I am actually now at Kennesaw State College. It was college then, it's university now, here in Atlanta, Georgia. Did an undergrad in international relations. The world was always a very curious, interesting place for me. So I wanted to do that and learn more about the world. And then after that, I wanted to zoom in on Africa, even just realizing as I was studying the world that I knew nothing about Africa, really. So I did my master's in African studies at Yale University, which was a fascinating and amazing 2 years. Had an opportunity to go abroad and do a Fulbright scholarship in Zanzibar in East Africa. I was learning Swahili at the time. And then after that, have just really had a 20+ year career in nonprofits. I've worked for a number of different nonprofits. I worked at Heifer International for 15 years. That's where I met Cindy and became friends with her. She and I were there at the same time. And then my most recent role prior to this one was as Chief Executive Officer for Junior Achievement Africa, which is an organization that worked with youth, an area of passion for me. And so I led JA's portfolio in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is about 15 different countries for a period of 5 years prior to coming to Global Village Project. So it's been a whirlwind of a career and a life, but a very exciting one.
That's amazing, Elizabeth. And, I was really excited when we connected a few months ago, because I had never heard of Global Village Project, and yet the work that it is doing is so profoundly important, especially now. And so, it just made me think about how we would kick off today's conversation. And I wish we had an hour to unpack all of this, but just to dive into how important it is for philanthropy to support something like the Global Village Project. I first wanted to ask you, knowing that philanthropy is not, there's been great things in philanthropy, but it's not exactly where we would like it to be. It's not really reflective of the opportunities that are out there today. So from your experience, what are 3 ways in which you would say philanthropy could be significantly more impactful?
I've been on the receiving side of philanthropy, and in that way have had, a lot of interaction with the giving side of philanthropy. And so I would say the first thing that I would give as advice that philanthropy can do to be impactful is to listen, listen, and listen. Mm-hmm. There's such a tendency in philanthropy to want to talk. We live in a world in which money has power, right? And so the people who have it tend to have a louder voice, unfortunately, than those who are in the trenches, who are experiencing where the need is. So I think there's a lot of listening to be done. That would be the first thing. And I would say also, it's important to respond when philanthropy is responsive, to respond to stated needs rather than perceived needs. And I
Mhm.
think that ties to the first point about listening, right? There's such a sense of immediate expertise that sort of comes with money, a sense that you know. And I just think it's very important when you listen, you can hear what people are saying, what the organizations that work in the trenches are saying they need, rather than what you think they need, because they really are the front line of impact with the communities that they're working with. Um, and then I'd also say finally that philanthropy needs to fund things and missions and efforts that are not necessarily sensational or sexy, for lack of a better word, or attractive. You know, the things that don't get attention need attention just as easily and as critically as the things that do. And so I would say that, you know, we need to really pay attention to all things. I remember being at a conference years ago. I think Tony Blair was speaking. He was talking about when he was running for president. He said, or for prime minister, he kept saying, you know, it's the economy and education. He kind of sang that throughout his campaign. And then finally, a journalist asked him one day, well, what about the other things? What about healthcare? Right. And he kind of had no answer. All these things matter. All of the different causes matter. And I don't think one necessarily matters more than the other. And so I think philanthropy needs to pay attention to the equity of need across different sectors.
And this is such a great point because, and of course, I cannot not respond to that because there's so much to say to what you just
Right.
shared with us, Elizabeth. And it's just, it resonates so much with my experience as well. And I feel like all of these things boil back to a point of risk taking
Mm-hmm.
and less control.
Mm-hmm.
If philanthropy was so much more focused on how 1, 10, 50, or $100 million can lead to an outcome across the board that we all agree is essential and is less burdened by micromanaging the how, again, not saying you don't have to do due diligence on the organizations you support, by all means do due diligence, but let the experts kind of determine the how. And I mean, imagine if the standard was, here's a $50 million grant for 4 organizations working on all facets of global health,
Mm-hmm.
or all facets of education or water. And it's enough capital that is going to allow you to do things like pay for staff, for research,
Yeah.
for all the things
Yeah.
that are essential to do
Yeah.
the work. We would be looking at a different kind of philanthropy.
Yeah.
And that's how you scale impact. And obviously, I'll stop there. But
No, I agree completely. I think, you know, so often for those of us who kind of live in writing grants as our day to day, one of the biggest dreaded questions or parameters that philanthropy and donors put around us is that there's often this tendency of not wanting to pay for staff. And we exist in a service culture where people and manpower is what keeps, you know, everything going. So when you don't pay for staff, essentially you're saying you don't want to pay for the work because it is the staff that
exactly.
does the work. So I agree. This often a frustration of too many guardrails put around the work and how it should be done.
Exactly. And it almost takes us, Elizabeth, to, this is a time where we just need to redefine why philanthropy. I mean, why are we looking to philanthropy? To
Mhm.
create these different changes at a systemic level, meaning we're addressing the root causes and it's going to scale locally and be adopted
Mhm.
by local governments and so forth. But redefining why philanthropy, as well as how we go about this. We don't blink an eye when it comes to pouring billions of dollars into new technologies and innovations led by business.
Absolutely.
And yet we can't do it with philanthropy. And I'm not saying it's never happening, but it's not the norm. And if accountability or transparency is the issue, then let's redefine that.
Mhm.
Let's redefine how we measure accountability and transparency. So I guess this goes to my second question for you, Elizabeth, which is, when you think about all the things that you could accomplish with the Global Village Project,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
How could you fully unleash that potential if, philanthropy were to change, and maybe what I'm asking, and sorry, I hope this is not confusing, but what are 2 to 3 shifts that could happen in the philanthropic industry that would enable you to like fully unleash the potential of the Global Village Project?
Gosh, that's such a great question. I think that, excuse me, I'm getting a dry throat here. I think that philanthropy can be unintentionally or can unintentionally sometimes breed a culture of effort rather than of impact. Excuse me, because of the way that it's structured, right?
Right.
And so nonprofits and non-governmental organizations, we spend so much time spinning our wheels trying to meet the needs of donors. And it can often feel like we're just checking boxes.
Mhm.
And it's not really making a difference to the impact that we seek to do. And so I think that philanthropy has, as a sector, has a lot of soul searching to do about how it contributes to that culture and what can be done to change that. And for us, I would say, to answer your question more directly, not everything can be measured, at least not measured in short spurts in 3 month and 6 month reports. And that philanthropy, if philanthropy were to really embrace the power of storytelling, and the power or the importance of anecdotal evidence,
Mhm.
I think sometimes that tells a better story than numbers ever could. And yet, we had philanthropy has such a preference for quantitative accountability, right? So I think of my team here and how much time we spend trying to gather quantitative evidence, or just, trying to be accountable in ways that don't really tell the full story. And if we didn't have that, I don't want to say burden because it is important work, but some of it can be extraneous.
Right.
It would just give us such freedom to be able to do the work in different ways, to be able to experiment, to be able to try new things when we see things not working, to be able to pivot. And often I think organizations are so tied to what has been written in the grant proposal and not deviating from that even when we see that it's not working. So those kinds of flexibilities, that kind of flexibility is a freedom that I think would just allow us to be impactful in exponential ways. Um, I think also reducing the burden around access to funding. Application processes are every nonprofit's
Yeah,
it's the
I
bane
know.
of our existence, and yet they're so critical because that's how we get the funding.
Mhm.
But there's so many hoops. There's so many hoops, and one of the biggest hoops is, you were just talking about innovation, which is a very, very wonderful thing when we get it right. But there's such an attachment to innovation, and anybody who's ever written a grant dreads the innovation question because the answers aren't always in innovation. Sometimes the impact isn't just doing the everyday work the way that you've always done it. And this push to do more, more, more. I think there's been a lot of studies, and a fairly recent one, and I forget now who wrote it, but just a study around at what point in organizations character and nature changes. And it's usually like at the number 100, I think was the answer that they came up with, right? Whether the number of people it impacts per year or the staff size, something like that, beyond 100. And so, and yet funders are saying this organization is wonderful because they have this human touch and because it's so intimate and the level of impact is so profound. Let's do more. Let's scale it to, 100,000. And
Right.
and in that process, however well-intentioned, the organizations tend to lose their character. They tend to lose the fiber of their being that makes them as impactful as they've always been. So I think there's a lot of work there to unpack about, our attachments to innovation and our attachments to scale and all of those things. So I think that that's the work that philanthropy needs to do on both sides, on the receiving end and on the giving end. And really work toward creating a balance of power between those who have a handout in terms of organizations and their constituents or their populations, and then those who are on the giving side.
I mean, that's even, that's great insight for me too, Elizabeth, because I often feel in my journey, I've always been pushing so much for more innovation, more scale. Like, why can't funders get behind that? Like, where is the blitz scaling
Right.
of social innovation? But what's so important about what you're saying, and again, it goes back to having this equilibrium, right?
Mhm.
In terms of how funding comes to an organization. We're not saying double down just in this one area or this one approach. I mean, there is so much to be said, and correct me if I'm wrong, Elizabeth, in the everyday work that has to happen without all of these different, barriers. Sometimes
Mhm.
it kind of feels like funding makes us do our work with our hands tied behind our back. You know what I mean? I
Absolutely.
have no
Absolutely.
right? It's like, let me just give me a year to get there. I have to experiment a little. I have to try. It's not going to be exactly, as we laid out. I mean, in what world does, an activity or a program go exactly as planned? What
Mhm.
we are together absolutely focused on is getting to this outcome that we both agree is so important. But for us to get to that place, it still also boils down to the trust that needs to happen in this industry. And, again, trust, accountability, all these things, we can have it in a way where we could rethink how that's defined and baked into a partnership. Um, Something different than like a grant with 60 restrictions and quarterly reporting and just things that really stall the process. So I really empathize with what you're saying, Elizabeth. And, I think where I would go to is to people who are listening to our conversation today, because I understand that, we can advocate for certain things, but we want all audiences to understand and hear. We need to empathize with each other,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So, what are two actionable steps that philanthropists or just individuals could take today to help bring some of this vision to life, what you just laid out for us in this interview?
Mm. Two things that come to mind. I think, first of all, honest conversations. So, going back to my first point about listening and its importance, have honest conversations. There's such a fear in the nonprofit sector of having those honest conversations and talking about what's not working, especially, right? We're conditioned to talk about what works because that's what donors want to hear. That's what they want to publicize. That's what they respond to. And I get that. That's important. But we need to be honest about what doesn't work, so that we can explore solutions. And that may be something that we need to put more effort into. We need to resource more. It may feel sometimes like pushing up against a wall, but how do we make change happen if we're not honest about the fact that it's not working, right? And I think, so that's one. And then I'd say the second thing is just really having and really embracing patience and a culture of patience within our sector. We want change to happen so fast. And we know that in the social sector, when you're trying to change human behaviors,
Yeah.
it's a slow process. It requires a lot of patience. We seem to have, to your reference earlier about, the comparisons between the private sector and our nonprofits or the public sector. We, with corporations, with the private sector, we have enormous patience with companies that don't turn a profit. I think of Twitter comes to mind, right? And I think for in the last year, maybe it was when they actually broke even or maybe turned a profit. I know they went at least 6 years without turning a profit. And yet, you look at their value in the stock market and it was still high and the company was still going and breeding millionaires. You could not dare to do something, have that kind of patience in the nonprofit sector if you don't create, generate an impact that's visible, that's sensational, that's attractive. Funders turn their backs. So I think that those are the two things that I would say is, when you as any individual who thinks about, and I really do think everybody should think about themselves as a philanthropist and, and not just a donor, because I think a donor is a transient kind of passing thing, but really examine yourself and your value systems and think, what is this thing that I want to really see solved in this world, right? And make an investment in that, not just a donation, an investment, and then be patient for that change to happen, and just keep at it, keep chipping at it, because that's how the change does happen. everything that we do in the sector, we have to take a long view on. Nothing's going to change overnight.
I love that. And, I'll just add that, gosh, it's so good, Elizabeth. I just this resonates so much. And I will confess that, patience is definitely not my strong suit.
Right.
It's not necessarily with impact,
Mhm.
but it's like we've got 10 years to turn things around. You have this record wealth that is just sitting there. You have all these great organizations that, have proven their successes. They're ready to scale. And can't we just embrace that there's different ways of
Yeah.
scaling? But I think it boils down to what you just said. If we could have honest conversations where when you're having those honest conversations, as a philanthropist, if you want to do rigorous due diligence, this is the time where you can
Yeah.
look at everything, look at the financial records, look at the people, understand the issue. Like, I understand, like you need to understand what it is that you're going to be
Yeah.
doing.
Absolutely.
But once you've passed that threshold, then make an investment with trust that
Mhm.
has those layers of patience, removing obstacles, barriers, just, let the organization experiment, try, come back, before
Fail.
you
Give them
just
the freedom to fail.
fail,
Freedom to fail is
fail.
enormous. Yeah.
Yeah. And just knowing that on the horizon, like we are all working towards that long-term outcome. It's just in terms of how we get there, build in that flexibility. And I also think we need to stop thinking of, grants as $1 million grant size. And this is where probably not everybody would agree with me, but if we're talking about billionaires adding $1.9 trillion to their wealth in a pandemic alone, why
Mhm.
can't the average grant be $50 million if
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
scale of the issues we're trying to address? So,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything to say to that, Elizabeth.
I agree completely. And, to your point earlier about patience, I'm not patient either. I'm very impatient. But I'm optimistic. And I know that change can happen. And that's why I've worked in the sector my whole career is because, however incremental change happens, and when you see the one person, just one person whose life has been changed by, constant effort, and the support and the investment, it's well worth it. It's well worth it.
I agree. And we are up for time, but I have to sneak in one more little comment, which is I loved your point about storytelling and narrative. This is one of the big reasons why we want to do this show, let alone the fact that we need to be honest and bold. We can't move forward if we don't unpack what's not working. Can't just keep
Absolutely.
endlessly focusing just on the opportunities, but the importance of narrative and storytelling and where that narrative is coming from,
Mhm.
and how that shapes perception, and where funding is going. And we can't just fund the cool stuff that's featured on CNN. So Elizabeth, we will continue this conversation. Really appreciate all that you shared with us today and having this conversation with me. The Global Village Project, everybody should check out what you're doing. And this is important work with refugees and the first school in the United States for refugees.
Thank you. Thank you. I am honored. It's my pleasure, and I have enjoyed it as well.